For 18 years, I made myself small. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it the way you describe a weather pattern, something that happens slowly over so many seasons that you stop noticing the temperature had changed at all. I made myself small in the kitchen, letting his opinions about how the coffee should be brewed win, even when mine were better. I made myself small at dinner parties, laughing a half second after everyone else so it was clear whose joke it was. I made myself small in my own name, answering the phone as Mrs. Whitfield, long after I'd stopped feeling like anyone had ever asked me who I wanted to be. Hello, my name is Margaret, and for 18 years, I was married to a man I loved and barely knew. I have told this story a few times now to close friends, in kitchens much like my own, and I have noticed that everyone leans forward at the same moment, waiting for the affair, waiting for the other woman, waiting for the ordinary betrayal they've been trained by so many other stories to expect. I understand that instinct completely, because I lived inside it myself for 18 years. But this isn't a story about an affair, though for a long time I was certain it was going to be. This is a story about a briefcase that was always locked, a Sunday that never belonged to me, and a truth so much larger and so much gentler than anything my fear had prepared me for. It's a story about what happens when you finally stop asking, "What is he hiding?" and start asking with an open hand instead of a clenched fist, "What is he carrying?" Before I tell you about the Sundays, I think you should know how we began, because I don't want you to imagine ours was a marriage built on distance from the very first day. It wasn't. I met my husband when I was 26, at a friend's engagement dinner of all places, seated across from a quiet man in a gray jacket who spent the entire evening listening far more than he spoke. I remember thinking at the time that his silence was a kind of steadiness, the opposite of the loud, restless men I had dated before him. He asked me questions and actually waited for the answers. He remembered, 3 weeks later, a small detail I had mentioned in passing about my mother's chipped mixing bowl, and he asked about it again, gently, as though it mattered to him, the way it mattered to me. I married him 2 years later, believing I had found a man whose quiet was a gift rather than a room with a locked door in it. For the first several years of our marriage, that belief held. We built a small life together in a house with a garden gone slightly wild at the edges, the kind of wildness I liked. We had our first child, a daughter, and 2 years later our son, and my husband was the sort of father who got up in the night without being asked, who never once complained about a ruined shirt or a sleepless week. I want you to hold that image alongside everything I'm about to tell you, because both things were true at once. He was a good man. He was also, without either of us quite naming it, a man who had already been keeping a secret for years before I ever sat across from him at that engagement dinner, a secret that predated me entirely and that I would not understand for almost 2 decades. I want to tell you how it started, because I think if I don't, you won't understand how something so small could grow into 18 years of silence. It was a Sunday in October, the kind where the light comes through the kitchen window low in gold, and everything looks like it's been dipped in honey. I remember I was washing a mixing bowl, the one with the chip in the rim that I never threw away because it had been my mother's, and I heard my husband's car start in the driveway. Not unusual, except it was 8:40 in the morning, and he hadn't said a word about leaving. I dried my hands on my apron and went to the window, and I watched him back out slowly, carefully, the way he did everything, and drive off down Larkspur Street without so much as a wave in my direction, though I know he must have seen me standing there. When he came home 4 hours later, I asked him, lightly, the way you ask a question when you don't yet know you're afraid of the answer, "Where did you disappear to this morning?" He said, "Just an errand, Margaret," and he set his keys on the hook by the door, and he went upstairs to shower, and that was the end of it. That was the first Sunday. I want you to understand that I didn't think anything of it, not that first time. Errands are errands. Husbands leave the house. This is not, on its own, the material of heartbreak. But then it happened the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. In other words, what started as a single strange morning became, without my noticing exactly when the shift occurred, a fixture of our marriage, a pattern with the weight of ritual behind it. Every single Sunday, rain or frost or the kind of summer heat that makes the asphalt shimmer, my husband would rise early, dress in the same navy sweater, take his brown leather briefcase, the one with the small brass clasp, the one I had bought him for our 5th anniversary, and leave the house for exactly 4 hours. He would come home a little quieter than when he left. He would kiss my forehead. He would ask what was for dinner, and he would carry that briefcase directly to the closet in his study and turn the small key in its lock, a lock I had never once seen him open in front of me. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering in a story like this one. For the first 2 years of the Sunday disappearances, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that every marriage needs its private rooms, its unspoken doors, and that a woman who pries loses something more valuable than what she might find. I had been raised, the way many of us were, to believe that a good wife does not interrogate. A good wife trusts. A good wife makes herself small enough that there is room in the house for whatever her husband needs to carry alone. What this actually meant for me was that I spent nearly 2 decades swallowing a question that sat in my throat like a stone I had learned to live around. I remember the year our daughter turned 12 and she asked me over pancakes, "Where does Dad go on Sundays?" And I remember the sensation that moved through my body when she said it. My hands went cold before my brain even caught up to the fear. It wasn't fear of an answer. It was fear of the silence I had built inside myself, finally being noticed by someone else. I told her, "He goes to see an old friend," because that was the story I had constructed for myself somewhere around year 3, a story with no evidence behind it except my own desperate need for a story that let me keep breathing. He goes to see an old friend. I said it so many times over the years that I nearly believed it myself. I said it to my daughter and later to my son, and once at a family gathering to my own sister, who raised an eyebrow and asked not unkindly, "And you've never asked which friend?" I remember laughing the question off, the way you laugh off anything that has already been sitting in you so long it has started to feel like furniture rather than a wound. But there were details that didn't fit inside that comfortable little sentence, details I kept in a drawer in the back of my mind and refused to open. The briefcase, for one. Why would a visit to an old friend require a locked briefcase? Why would that briefcase, on the rare occasions I brushed against it while cleaning his study, feel heavier than paper should feel? Why, when I once asked gently, almost by accident, "Does your friend live far?" why did his jaw tighten in a way I had only seen twice before in 18 years of marriage, both times when his mother had been mentioned? I think most women know the particular quality of silence that comes from a husband who is choosing his words. It's different from the silence of a man who has nothing to say. This was a curated silence, a silence with architecture, and I lived inside its rooms for so long that I began to mistake it for the whole house. There is a particular year I think about often. The year our son turned 16 and started asking harder questions about everything, the way teenagers do, testing the walls of the world to see which ones are load-bearing. He came to me once, late at night, unable to sleep, and asked, almost as an afterthought, "Does Dad have another family somewhere?" I remember the shock of hearing my own private fear said aloud in my son's voice, as though he had reached into the locked drawer of my chest without permission. I told him no, firmly, more firmly than I felt it, and I sent him to bed, and I lay awake long after, wondering how many other people in our life had quietly wondered the same thing, and simply never said it to my face. There was another year, somewhere near the middle of that long stretch, when my own mother fell ill, and I spent months driving back and forth to her small apartment across town, exhausted in a way I had never been exhausted before. I remember resenting, in the quiet, ungenerous way exhaustion allows a person to resent even the people they love, that my husband still disappeared every Sunday regardless of how much I needed him at home. I remember once, standing in my mother's kitchen at 2 a.m. after a bad night, thinking bitterly that whatever he did on those Sunday mornings clearly mattered more to him than the rest of the week mattered to me. I did not yet know that the woman he visited every Sunday had, herself, buried a husband, and that some quiet, unspoken part of him recognized in my mother's illness an echo of a grief he understood better than I could have imagined. He never told me that connection existed. He simply came, when he could, and held my hand in hospital corridors, and I mistook his silence about his own losses for an absence of understanding, when in truth, he understood loss more intimately than almost anyone I have ever known. Let me tell you about the years in between, because I don't want you to think this was a marriage defined only by one locked closet and 4 missing hours a week. We had a good life, in the ways that are visible from the outside. He was a steady man, a quiet man who remembered how I took my tea and who never once raised his voice at our children, even when they deserved it. He worked as an actuary, if you can believe that. A man whose entire profession is calculating risk, married to a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the greatest risk of all was asking him a direct question. We built a home. We raised 2 children who grew into kind adults. We had a garden that I was, if I'm allowed a small moment of pride, rather good at keeping alive. We took modest vacations to the coast every few summers, and I have photographs of him laughing on those trips, entirely at ease. The same man who would tighten at the mention of his mother, the same man who disappeared every Sunday behind a locked brass clasp. I want you to understand that the 2 versions of him were never separate men. They were the same man, holding 2 entirely different weights, and I only ever saw the lighter one. From a distance, if you had looked at our life through the window, the way I once looked at his car pulling out of the driveway, you would have seen nothing but gold light and a woman washing a chipped bowl. You would never have guessed at the stone in her throat. The stone grew heavier as the years went by, not lighter, the way I once hoped it would. I want to explain this feeling to you, because I think many of you carry your own version of it. It is not the sharp, immediate pain of catching someone in a lie. It is a low, persistent ache, the kind that lives in your lower back after too many years of carrying something you were never given the tools to put down. It is the ache of loving someone whose full self you are not entirely sure you're allowed to know. There were nights I lay beside him and studied the shape of his shoulder in the dark. And I thought, I have shared a bed with this man for 18 years, and there is a version of his Sundays that belongs entirely to someone else. I never once believed, not truly, that there was another woman. My husband was not a man built for deception of that particular kind. His lies, if you could even call them that, were lies of omission, not seduction. But not believing in another woman did not stop the questions from multiplying in the dark. A gambling debt, a secret son from before we met, a family he was ashamed of, some illness he was hiding, some doctor's office he visited weekly and didn't want me to worry over. My mind, given 18 years and no honest answers, built an entire wing of a house I had never been invited to see, and furnished every room of it with a different fear, so that by the time the truth finally arrived, I had already grieved a dozen imagined versions of my own marriage. I want to pause here and say something to whoever is listening to this and recognizes themselves in it. If you have spent years quietly shrinking yourself around someone else's silence, please hear me when I say that this is not weakness. It is not evidence that you didn't love enough, or trust enough, or ask the right way. Sometimes the people we love build rooms we cannot enter not because they don't trust us, but because they are terrified that opening the door will let out something they have never learned how to carry in company. I did not know this yet, in the years I'm describing to you. I only knew the ache, and the stone, and the gold Sunday light I had come to associate with dread instead of peace. I think, too, about a conversation I had with my own mother, years before she passed, in which I finally admitted to her, in a whisper, over tea, that I sometimes feared my marriage was hollow at its center, built around an absence I couldn't name. She had been married 41 years to my father by then, and she said something to me that I dismissed at the time and have thought about almost daily since. She said, "Margaret, sometimes the quietest men are carrying the heaviest things, and it is not always fear that keeps them silent. Sometimes it is love, misapplied, aimed at protecting you from a weight they don't yet trust you to help carry." I remember being irritated by this at the time, because it felt like an excuse dressed up as wisdom. I understand now that she wasn't excusing him. She was trying, in her own gentle way, to tell me that the answer to a locked door is rarely to break it down, and rarely either, to simply stop noticing it exists. The answer, she seemed to be saying, though neither of us had the language for it yet, was to keep loving the man on the other side of the door until he trusted you enough to open it himself. There is one particular Sunday, years before the ending I'm about to tell you, that I still return to. Our daughter was away at university, our son was at a friend's house, and I had the rare gift of an empty afternoon entirely to myself. Instead of enjoying it, I found myself standing outside the locked closet in his study, my hand resting flat against the wood, not trying the handle, just resting there, the way you might rest your hand against a door behind which someone you love is crying, unsure whether to knock. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes before I made myself walk away, ashamed of an impulse I couldn't yet name as anything other than suspicion. I did not know, that afternoon, that what waited behind that door would one day make me weep with an entirely different kind of grief than the one I was bracing for. The turning point. The moment the 18 years of smallness began, very quietly, to end. Happened on a Sunday in March, 2 years ago now, though it feels both like yesterday and like another lifetime entirely. My husband had left at his usual hour. I remember I stood at the window longer than I normally allowed myself, watching his car until it turned the corner and disappeared, and something in me simply refused to turn away and go back to the dishes. I don't know how to explain the shift, except to say that 18 years of swallowed questions had finally reached a kind of critical mass, a pressure that could no longer be absorbed by silence and gardening and the comfortable lie about an old friend. I got in my own car. I want you to understand that my hands were shaking on the wheel, not with anger, but with something closer to grief. The grief of a woman who is about to either confirm her worst fear or discover that she has spent 18 years afraid of nothing at all, and either possibility, in that moment, felt unbearable. I followed him at a careful distance, the way you see people do in films, feeling faintly ridiculous and entirely unable to stop myself. He drove out of our quiet suburb, past the shopping plaza, past the church we used to attend before our schedules got too full for Sunday mornings that weren't already spoken for, and onto the highway heading toward the older part of the city, a part we rarely had reason to visit. I remember the radio was on low in my car, some forgettable song playing beneath the sound of my own heartbeat, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should turn it off, as though the silence in the car might somehow help me see more clearly. He parked in front of a modest brick building, the kind with flower boxes under the windows that someone clearly tended with care, and he sat in his car for a long moment before he got out. I parked half a block away, my heart behaving like something trying to escape my chest, and I watched him walk to the door with that same brown briefcase in his hand. He paused on the step before knocking, and I saw him roll his shoulders back, the way he did before difficult meetings at work, as though he were steadying himself for something that still, after however many years, required steadying. A woman answered. My stomach dropped in a way I am not proud of, a purely animal reaction that had nothing to do with the 18 years of trust I had tried, however imperfectly, to build. But she was older than me by at least a decade, silver-haired, wearing an apron dusted with flour, and when she opened the door, she didn't embrace him the way a secret lover would. She embraced him the way a mother embraces a son who has been coming to her door faithfully for longer than either of them could probably remember. My husband followed her inside, and the door closed, and I sat in my car on that unfamiliar street for the better part of an hour, unable to make myself leave and unable to make myself walk up and knock. I want to tell you what I felt in that hour, because it wasn't relief and it wasn't vindication. It was a strange, hollow grief for the 18 years I had spent constructing elaborate fears out of a silence that might have held something far more tender than betrayal. I didn't yet know what I was looking at, but some old, tired part of me already understood that, whatever it was It wasn't the thing I had spent nearly 2 decades bracing for. I watched a light come on in an upstairs window at one point, warm and yellow against the gray afternoon, and I remember thinking, with a kind of quiet ache, that whatever was happening inside that house looked, from the outside, almost like a home. I didn't confront him that day. I drove home before he came out, and I stood at the kitchen sink, and when he arrived 4 hours after he'd left, kissed my forehead and asked what was for dinner. I said nothing. I want to be honest and tell you that the not saying anything wasn't peace. It was the last, thinnest thread of the old pattern, the pattern of the small woman who didn't ask. But something had shifted, even if I couldn't yet say it out loud. I began paying closer attention, not through following him again, but through the small archaeology of a shared life. I noticed that on the 15th of every month, a modest sum left our joint account under a label I had never once questioned: Personal MW. I had always assumed it was some subscription, some quiet indulgence I didn't need to monitor because I trusted him with our finances the way I trusted him with everything else I'd never examined too closely. I noticed that he kept a small, worn photograph in his wallet, tucked behind his license, of a man I didn't recognize standing beside a much younger version of my husband, both of them in military fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. I noticed, too, a birthday in his calendar every June, marked only with the initial D, a day on which he was always slightly quieter than usual, slightly slower to laugh, though I had never once, in all our years together, thought to ask him whose day it was. I want to explain what this discovery by fragments felt like, because I think it's different from the dramatic reveal you see in films, where a single locked drawer bursts open and spills every secret at once. This was slower. This was finding one true thing every few weeks and having to sit with it, turn it over, let it reshape the shape of the man I thought I knew, before I was given the next piece. Some weeks I found nothing at all, and I would almost convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, that the woman with the flower-dusted apron was simply a distant cousin, that the photograph was nothing, that the initial in the calendar meant doctor or dentist or some other unremarkable word. And then another small piece would surface, and the fragile piece I had built for myself would dissolve again. The photograph was what finally moved me to speak. It was a Tuesday evening. Nothing sacred about it. No particular anniversary or occasion to make the moment feel earned. We were doing the dishes together, a small domestic ritual we'd kept through all the years, even as so much else between us had gone quiet, and I said, without any of the accusation I'd carried in my chest for so long, "Who is the man in the photograph in your wallet?" His hands stopped moving in the water. I watched something pass over his face that I had seen only rarely, the same tightening I'd seen when his mother was mentioned, but deeper this time, older, like a door being tested from the other side. For a moment I thought he might simply say a name and nothing more, the way he had said, "just an errand," 1,000 Sundays before. But instead, he set down the plate in his hands, dried them slowly on the towel, and turned to look at me with an expression I had never once seen on him in 18 years of marriage. Not guilt, but something closer to relief, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been standing at attention for so long that his body has forgotten what it feels like to be given permission to rest. He asked me to sit down with him at the table, and something in his voice, not fear, but a kind of exhausted relief, the sound of a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it, told me that whatever came next was the truth I had been circling for 18 years. His name was Daniel, my husband told me. They had served together, decades before I ever met my husband, in a posting that had asked more of both of them than either had ever spoken about, even to me. Daniel had been the kind of friend, my husband said, that you are only given once or twice in a life, if you are fortunate at all. They had trained together, been assigned together, spent 2 years of their lives in circumstances so far outside anything I had ever known that my husband struggled, even now, to find the words for them in our quiet kitchen. He told me that Daniel was the sort of man who made difficult days bearable simply by being present in them, quick to laugh, quicker to notice when someone else needed to laugh, the kind of person whose absence, once it came, would leave a hole no replacement could ever quite fill. And near the end of their service, in circumstances my husband still could not describe without his voice catching in a way I had never once heard in 18 years of marriage, Daniel had saved his life. Not in the metaphorical way people use that phrase carelessly, in the plain, literal way that means one man is alive today and walking around a kitchen doing dishes with his wife, because another man made a choice, in a single unbearable second, to put himself between his friend and something none of us are meant to have to imagine. Daniel did not survive that choice. I sat very still at our kitchen table while my husband told me this, and I understood, all at once, the shape of 18 years of Sundays. He told me about the weeks that followed, weeks I had never known about because they had happened years before we met. Weeks spent in a hospital bed with an injury he had always attributed vaguely to an accident during service, a phrase I had accepted the way I accepted so much else without asking for the fuller sentence behind it. He told me that in that hospital bed, he had made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of his life, long before I ever became part of it, and that he had never once considered breaking that decision, not even when it meant carrying a silence into our marriage that he now understood, with visible pain on his face, had cost me something he never meant to take. Daniel had a daughter. She was 3 years old when her father died, too young to remember him except through photographs and other people's stories, and her mother, the silver-haired woman with the flour-dusted apron, whose name, I would learn, was Eleanor, had been left to raise her alone, in a country that did not always make room for the families of men who did not come home. My husband told me that in the hospital, weeks after he returned, weeks after the worst of his own recovery, he had made Daniel's widow a promise. Not a grand theatrical promise, but a quiet one, the kind made between two people who understand exactly how much weight a single sentence can be asked to hold. He told her that her daughter would never grow up wondering whether her father's death had mattered to anyone but her. He had kept that promise every single Sunday for over 20 years, long before I ever met him, long after we married, and long after that promise should have, by any reasonable measure, become something he mentioned to me, at least once, in 18 years. The money that left our account every month was not a secret indulgence. It had gone, first, toward a little girl's school fees, and later toward a young woman's university tuition, and in recent years, toward the modest brick house with the flower boxes, which he had quietly helped Daniel's widow purchase so she would never again have to worry about being able to keep a roof over the head of the child her husband had died to protect. The locked briefcase held not evidence of an affair, but decades of paperwork. Bank statements, tuition receipts, photographs, letters, the entire architecture of a promise, kept in the dark not because he was ashamed of it, but because, as he told me that night with his voice breaking in a way that undid something in my chest I had held tight for 18 years, he did not know how to hold something so sacred to him out in the light without feeling that he might somehow break it. He told me, too, about the June birthday marked only with an initial in his calendar. It was not Daniel's birthday, as I had guessed, but the anniversary of the day Daniel died, a day my husband had marked privately, alone, every single year of our marriage, without ever once inviting me to grieve alongside him, because he had convinced himself, somewhere in the earliest days of our courtship, that a grief so large did not belong in a new marriage, that a woman who had just fallen in love with him deserved a lighter man than the one who carried that particular June morning inside him. I understood, hearing this, that he had not only hidden Daniel's death from me, he had hidden his own mourning, folding it small enough to fit inside a single letter on a calendar page, for 18 years. In other words, what I had spent 18 years fearing as the evidence of my husband's secret other life was, in fact, the evidence of the deepest fidelity I had ever witnessed in another human being. Not to me, though I would come to understand it included me in ways I hadn't yet grasped, but to a promise made to a dying friend, honored in total silence, for over 2 decades, without a single Sunday missed. I asked him, once he had finished, the question that had been sitting beneath all my other questions for 18 years. I asked him why he had never told me. He said that in the early years of our marriage, he had been afraid that if he spoke Daniel's name too often, he would have to explain the parts of that day he had never fully allowed himself to remember out loud, not even to himself. And later, once the silence had calcified into habit, he said he had been afraid of something else entirely, afraid that if he told me, the promise would somehow become smaller, a story instead of a practice, a thing discussed instead of a thing done. He said, and I have thought about this sentence every day since, I was so afraid of losing the sacredness of it that I nearly lost you instead. He told me, too, about the day my mother had been so ill, the day I had stood alone in her kitchen at 2 a.m, convinced that his Sundays mattered more to him than my exhaustion did. He said that he had almost told me everything that week, that watching me care for my dying mother had nearly broken open the silence he'd kept for so long, because he recognized, in my own grief, the same grief Eleanor had carried since the day her husband didn't come home. He said he had sat in his car outside her house that particular Sunday and wept, not only for Daniel, but for me, and for the double weight we were both quietly carrying without ever setting it down together. He had come home that evening and held my hand in the hospital corridor, and I had felt, at the time, only the comfort of his presence, never guessing at the fuller comfort he had wanted to offer and hadn't yet found the courage to give. He told me one more thing that night, something I have carried with me since, gently, the way you carry something you know you'll need again. He said that every Sunday, before he knocked on Eleanor's door, he sat in the car for a moment and thought of me, not out of guilt, he said, but out of a kind of quiet gratitude, because he believed, in some way he had never found the words to explain, that the life we had built together was the very thing that made it possible for him to keep showing up at that door for over 20 years. He said my steadiness, even the steadiness he now understood, had cost me so much silent fear, had been the ground he stood on while he held Daniel's promise. He had simply never told me I was holding him up, because he had never learned how to say it out loud. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation, because I think the ending matters as much as the years of silence that came before it. I did not turn away from him. I did not feel as I might have expected to feel after so many years of quiet dread, betrayed by the shape of what I'd found. I felt, instead, an overwhelming tenderness for the man who had carried a promise like a second invisible marriage for 2 decades, entirely alone, because he did not yet trust that love could hold both grief and devotion at once without breaking. We sat at that kitchen table for a long time after he finished speaking, neither of us in any hurry to stand, as though standing up might somehow end the fragile, unfamiliar closeness that had opened between us. I remember reaching across the table and taking his hand, the same hand that had carried that locked briefcase every Sunday for as long as I had known him, and feeling, for the first time in 18 years, that I finally understood the full weight of what it had been holding. The following Sunday, for the first time in 18 years, I asked to come with him. He looked at me for a long moment in the kitchen doorway, that same navy sweater already on, the briefcase already in his hand, and something in his face loosened in a way I had never seen before, not once, not in all our years together. He said quietly, "I'd like that." I met Daniel's widow that day. Her name was Eleanor, and she held my hands in both of hers at the door and said, "He's told me so much about you," which undid me more than I expected, because it meant that in the house I had once imagined as the site of my husband's other life, my own name had been spoken with love for years I hadn't known about. She made tea in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and old wood, and she showed me, without my needing to ask, a small shelf near the window where she kept photographs of Daniel, young, laughing, impossibly alive in every frame, alongside newer photographs of her daughter at graduations and birthdays, a quiet visual timeline of a promise being kept, year after year, in a house I had spent one terrified afternoon, watching from half a block away. I met Daniel's daughter, grown now into a poised young woman studying to become a nurse, who thanked me, unprompted, for sharing my husband with her family every Sunday of her childhood. Not understanding, of course, that I had spent those same Sundays believing I was being betrayed by his absence, rather than ennobled by his loyalty. She told me stories about my own husband that I had never heard in 18 years of marriage, how he had taught her to ride a bicycle in the small park behind Eleanor's first apartment, how he had sat in the front row at every school recital her own busy, grieving mother sometimes couldn't manage to attend, how he had once driven 4 hours through a snowstorm because she'd called him, 16 years old and frightened, after a car accident that had shaken her more than it had hurt her. I sat in that warm kitchen and listened to an entire second history of my husband unfold in front of me, a history built entirely out of the hours I had spent, for so many years, resenting his absence rather than understanding its shape. Months later, I sat in the front row at that same young woman's nursing school graduation, beside Eleanor, beside my husband, clapping until my hands ached, feeling something settle in my chest that I can only describe as belonging. Afterward, she found me in the crowd, still in her cap and gown, and pressed a small, worn photograph into my hand, a copy of the very picture I'd once found hidden in my husband's wallet, Daniel and my husband young and laughing in their fatigues. On the back, in her handwriting, she had written, "For the woman who shared him with us and never even knew it, thank you for 18 years." I did not manage to say anything in response. I simply held her, this young woman I had known for only a matter of months, and wept for every year I had spent afraid of a love story I had actually, all along, been quietly living inside. I think, too, of the ordinary Sundays since, the ones with no revelations left to uncover, just tea in Eleanor's kitchen, and the particular ease of a house with nothing left to hide in it. I have learned to make the cinnamon bread Eleanor taught me, the same recipe, I later learned, that Daniel's own mother used to make, passed down now through 3 women who never expected to become family to one another. My husband sits at that table on Sunday afternoons, looking lighter than I ever remember him looking in the first 16 years of our marriage. And I understand now that the lightness was always available to him, if only he had believed sooner that I was strong enough to help him carry it. Some evenings, after we've come home from Eleanor's and the house has gone quiet again, I find him standing at the window of his study, the closet door open now, unlocked, the old brown briefcase sitting in plain view on the shelf where it belongs. I no longer feel the old dread when I pass that door. I feel, instead, a kind of reverence, the way you might feel passing a small shrine tended faithfully for 20 years by someone who never once asked for recognition. I think of all the versions of this story I might have told myself over the years, had I never found the courage to ask a single question at that kitchen sink. I think of how easily 18 years could have become 28, or 38, both of us growing old inside a silence neither of us knew how to end. And I am grateful, every single Sunday now, that I finally let myself be curious instead of afraid. I think about the 18 years often. I think about all the small ways I made myself smaller around a silence I misunderstood. And I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who recognizes their own stone in the throat, their own locked briefcase, their own Sunday that doesn't belong to them, not every silence is a wound waiting to happen. Some silences are simply the shape love takes when a person has not yet learned how to carry something sacred out loud. That does not mean you were wrong to ache. I want to be honest about that too. My ache was real, and it deserved to be spoken, and it took me 18 years too long to speak it. If I could go back, I would not tell myself to trust blindly and wait patiently for 2 decades. I would tell myself that a marriage cannot survive on one partner's silence alone, no matter how noble the reason behind it, and that the 4 words I finally found the courage to say, "Who is the man?" were owed to me far sooner than year 18. But I would also tell myself this, and I offer it now to you. However you came to be listening tonight, carrying whatever silence of your own you might be carrying, know your worth. And never shrink yourself so small that you stop believing you're allowed to ask the questions that keep you up at night. Your peace matters as much as anyone else's privacy, and no promise, however sacred, is well served by a marriage built on one person's constant, quiet fear. Understand that curiosity is not betrayal, that asking is not distrust, that a woman who wants to understand the man she loves is not a woman failing at trust. She is a woman practicing the deepest form of it, and there is nothing disloyal about wanting to know the whole shape of the person you have chosen to spend your life beside. Remember that a promise kept in silence is still a kind of love, but a marriage cannot run only on the parts of a person willing to be seen. It needs the whole person, the grief and the devotion both, spoken into the light, where the other person can hold it with you, rather than locked in a briefcase carried alone every Sunday for 20 years. Give grief its proper name when you meet it in someone you love, even when it arrives wearing an unfamiliar disguise. I spent 18 years mistaking my husband's mourning for distance, his loyalty for secrecy, his tenderness for someone else, for a betrayal of me. Grief does not always look like tears at a funeral. Sometimes it looks like a locked briefcase and a Sunday that never explains itself. And if I had known, sooner, to ask with curiosity instead of dread, I believe we would have found our way to this same table years earlier, with far less unnecessary suffering carried in between. And believe, finally, that the truth, when it came, was never going to be the monster I had built in 18